This is Chapter 2, Learning Objective 4. Computing wages and salaries. The most common pay periods are biweekly, which would be every 2 weeks. And it doesn't necessarily have to be on Fridays, but lots of times it is. Semi-monthly, which is twice a month, monthly, and weekly. The employer might have different pay periods for different groups within the same company. Some people might be paid monthly, others might be paid bi-weekly. So how do you calculate overtime pay? There's two methods. The most common method is you calculate the gross pay, which is 40 hours times the employee's regular rate, and then the overtime is calculated by taking 1.5 times the employer's regular rate times the hours worked in excess of 40. The other method is calculate the gross pay, so all the hours worked times the employer's regular rate, and then calculate an overtime premium, which the overtime premium is just half of the hourly rate. So any hours in excess of 40 get paid an extra overtime premium rate on top of the regular rate. Either way, you're going to come up with the same total gross pay. So if you may have, the employer might have somebody working for them that gets paid different rates for different jobs, and then when they work overtime, how do you know what to pay them because they're getting paid different rates? So there's 3 different ways to do this. One is you could just say all the overtime that you work, you get paid at the higher rate. The other one is basically you take a weighted average. You take the total earnings for all the jobs, and that's the gross earnings, divided by the total hours, and then that becomes your rate, sort of your reconfigured regular rate, and then you take that the overtime premium would be half of that. Or you can say, all right, whatever job you were working on after you'd worked 40 hours, whether it was the lower paying rate or the higher paying rate, that's the rate that you were going to use to calculate the overtime. So some steps to follow when you're converting period wage rates to hourly rates. Because a lot of, they're salaried people and they're not paid hourly, but if they're working overtime, you've got to be able to calculate an hourly rate. So, first thing that you do is you annualize the salary. Then you calculate the regular weekly gross. And then you calculate the hourly pay, and you calculate the overtime rate, which is 1.5 times the hourly rate, and then add the overtime pay to the regular. So I rush through those because they really doesn't mean a lot until you can see some numbers. So here's example number 1. We have a salary quoted to a non-exempt employee, meaning we have to pay them overtime. It's $1,500 a month, paid weekly, and they worked 43 hours in one pay period. So they've obviously got some overtime, 3 hours of overtime. How are we going to calculate the overtime? First you annualize it, so times it by 12, because it's monthly, 18,000 annually. Then divide that by 52 so that you get the weekly gross, 346.15. Then you take that and you divide it by 40 hours, because that's the standard, 40 hours a week. So their regular rate is $8.65. Then you just take that times 1.5, and the overtime rate is 12.98. And so for that 3 hours over 40, because they worked 43 hours, take the regular 40 hours at this rate, that's the weekly rate, and then take your overtime times your hours times the overtime rate. So that would be 385 gross. Okay, here's another example. $2,000 a month. It's paid semi-annually, and there's 4 hours of overtime in one pay period. So you have to annualize it. 2,000 times 12, because it's paid monthly. The 2,000 is for a month. Okay. Then there are 24 pay periods. So 24,000 divided by 24 is 1,000 is the semi-monthly gross. Then you take the 24,000 and divide it by the number of weeks, so you can get the regular weekly rate. And then you take the weekly rate divided by 40 hours to get the regular rate. Okay? Then 1.5 times the regular rate is the overtime rate. So in this case, you would take the semi-monthly gross of 1,000 plus the 4 hours of overtime at the overtime rate is 1,069.24. Okay, here's another example. 2,000 a month is the salary for a 38-hour work week, paid semi-monthly. And there are two rates in addition to the semi-monthly gross. The regular pay between 38 and 40 hours a week, and then after 40 hours a week they're going to get overtime. And of the 16 hours of overtime in one pay period, then only 12 is over 40, because the other difference of 4 hours was 38 to 40. So basically they're usually working 38 hours, but if they happen to work up to 40, they don't get paid overtime, but after overtime they do get paid. So again, take the 2,000, times it by 12 to annualize it. Divide it by 24, so it's $1,000 semi-monthly. Divide that by 52 to get the weekly rate. This is what we did before. Then, since it was based on 38 hours, the semi-annual rate, the semi-monthly rate is based on 38 hours, then you divide it by 38, not 40. 12.5 is a regular, times that by 1.5, and you end up with the overtime rate of 18.23. So you take your 1,000 for the monthly regular, plus the extra 4 hours, because they worked between 38 and 40, 16 hours of overtime, but 4 of it was still between the 38 and 40 hours. So that gets paid at the regular rate, and then the overtime rate is for the 12 that were over 40. So there's your gross. So the thing to note about this is, even though they worked 16 hours of overtime, only 12 were over 40, so that's the 40 are only covered by, the 12 are covered by the overtime, and that extra 4 is over and above their 38, so they do get paid extra for it, but just not at the overtime rate. Okay, here's a fourth example. $1,600 a month for a 35-hour work week, paid semi-monthly. Overtime is calculated as regular hourly pay between 35 and 40, and 1.5 times after 40. And of the 16 hours of overtime in one pay period, 6 hours are over the 40 hours weekly. So this is very similar to the last one. So it's monthly, so times it by 12 to annualize it. Then you're going to divide it by 24 to get the semi-monthly gross. Then divide it by 52 to get the weekly rate, and divide that by 35 because that's what their salary is based on, 35 hours. So that's your regular rate. The overtime then is 1.5 times the regular rate. So they're going to get paid their $800 plus the regular rate for, they worked 16 hours of overtime, but 10 of that is paid at the regular rate of $10.55, and the other 6 is paid at the overtime rate. Okay, example 5. Salary quoted non-exempt employee is $2,200 a month. It's paid bi-weekly. You have 11.5 hours of overtime in one pay period. So, annualize the salary. Divide it by 26. Bi-weekly means every 2 weeks. So that's the bi-weekly rate. Take that, the annual, divide it by 52 to get the weekly rate. Take the weekly rate, divide it by 40 to get the regular hourly rate. And then times it by 1.5 to get the overtime rate. So how much are they going to get paid? Well, they're going to get paid the bi-weekly rate plus the overtime rate for the 11.5 hours. So that would be their gross.